According to the customs of this university, we open this academic session with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti Gratia, illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Please take a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here at Radboud University Nijmegen, either here in this room or connected via Zoom or following the ceremony via the live stream. A special word of welcome to you, Ms. Manhardt, and the people who are entitled to assist you in the defense of your thesis, the paranyms, Linda Drijvers, Julia Egger, Tom Uitenbogert. They will be present on Zoom, which does not facilitate the assistance. Also, a word of welcome to the 4 interpreters, Martha Cousins, Tessa Heldens, Gail Meisjes and Ferdinand Wagenaar. Welcome to you all in this session. In turn, I will present the members of the examination board. Before that, I already present 2 persons. One next to me, the supervisor, physically present, Professor Ujurik, and the co-supervisor, Dr. Brouwer, present on Zoom. They are not going to ask any questions, as they already asked a lot of them, I think, in the last couple of years. I now give the floor to the candidate for the degree of doctor.
With the permission of the Council of Deans, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled A Tale of Two Modalities, How Modality Shapes Language Production and Visual Attention. Our ability to communicate with each other using language is at the heart of what makes us human. However, languages around the world differ in their sounds, words, and grammar. Consequently, there are sometimes big differences between languages in the way they package and represent different aspects of our experiences. This language diversity can cause speakers of different languages to see the world with different eyes. Especially between spoken and sign languages, there are fundamental differences in how meaning is expressed. Sign languages are real and complex languages used by deaf communities, and they use a different modality than spoken languages. Not the mouth and vocal cords, but the visible parts of the body using hand, face, and body movements. One of the main goals of my dissertation was to ask, does this language diversity in modality, so vocal versus visual, influence hearing speakers and deaf signers' linguistic descriptions and the way they look at the world differently in order to talk about it? In my dissertation, I addressed this by comparing hearing users of a spoken language, in particular Dutch, and deaf users of a sign language, in particular Sign Language of the Netherlands, in short NGT. In addition, I studied what happens if one person knows 2 different languages, such as a sign language and a spoken language. These bilinguals are called bimodal bilinguals because their languages are produced in 2 modalities, and these can be deaf or hearing people that use a sign and a spoken language. In my dissertation, I have focused on the hearing bimodal bilinguals. I addressed whether they speak and sign differently because the 2 languages might influence each other. And I also addressed whether this affects the way they look at the world in order to talk about it. To explore these questions, I studied descriptions of pictures that show 2 objects which are in a spatial relation to each other, such as here, the lollipop is to the left of the glass. I chose this spatial domain because it has been previously shown that spoken and sign languages differ immensely from another when it comes to describing such relations. Here I want to highlight two main differences. The first, spoken languages like Dutch or English use often arbitrary forms like the word left to describe the relation between the lollipop and the glass. Signers, however, can talk about these relations in a much more visual way. So let's have first a look at an example. I'll play it twice. Thus, after introducing the lexical signs for the glass and the lollipop, signers can depict spatial relations by visually resembling the glass's shape, like a round shape, and the lollipop's shape, it's the long elongated stick shape, as well as their location by mirroring these aspects with their hands and placing them in front of the body. This visual resemblance I call iconicity in my dissertation and in the remainder of this presentation. The second difference concerns the order in which the glass and the lollipop are mentioned. Spoken languages differ in their preference for which object is mentioned when describing such relations. But signers of many sign languages use a consistent order in which they mention the two objects, that is, usually bigger objects such as the glass first, and the smaller objects such as the lollipop later. Looking at these two differences, I created one experiment that I used throughout my dissertation in all experimental chapters, for which I have combined picture descriptions with an eye-tracking experiment. This way I investigated possible relations between the way hearing speakers, deaf signers, and bimodal bilinguals describe pictures of spatial relations and how they look at these pictures in order to talk about them. In detail, participants saw always 4 pictures on the screen. Each picture showed the same two objects, for example the glass and the lollipop, but always in different spatial relations, such as here the lollipop was to the left of the glass or on the glass, etc. The participants' task was first to look at the pictures and then describe the one indicated by an arrow to a trained interlocutor whose hearing status matched that of the participant. Hearing bimodal bilinguals were tested twice, once in each language with matching hearing speaking and deaf signing interlocutors respectively of the session they were in. My dissertation contains 4 experimental chapters in which I used the same experiment that I have just described and the same hearing speakers, deaf signers and hearing bimodal bilinguals. In Chapter 2, I was interested in whether hearing speakers and deaf signers look at spatial relations differently when planning to talk about it. In Chapter 3 to 5, I looked at hearing bimodal bilinguals and compared their picture descriptions and/or eye movements to the hearing speakers and deaf signers. More in detail in Chapter 3, I wanted to see how hearing bimodal bilinguals speak and sign, thus how a spoken and a sign language can influence each other within one person. In Chapter 4, I explored how hearing bimodal bilinguals look at spatial relations to talk about them based on the descriptions that were investigated in Chapter 3. And finally, in Chapter 5, I explored how hearing bimodal bilinguals speak and sign and how this affects the way they look at spatial relations when planning to talk about them. This time, I looked at the second difference that concerns the order in which the glass and lolly were mentioned. Due to the limitation of time, I will not discuss all chapters in detail, but rather focus on 2 chapters more closely, and that's Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. In Chapter 2, I was interested in how hearing speakers and deaf signers look at spatial relations differently when planning to speak or sign about them because the descriptions are arbitrary in speech versus iconic in sign. I found that hearing speakers look mostly at the picture they have to describe, just the one at which the arrow is pointing, while planning to speak. Deaf signers, however, looked increasingly at all four pictures when planning to sign, despite that they only had to describe one of them. I argued that this is because signing about spatial relations might require extra attention in order to disambiguate how to form and shape the hands and where to place them in front of the body. In Chapter 3, I was interested in how a spoken and a sign language can influence each other within one person, looking at the same iconicity difference. Starting with speech, in this chapter I found that bimodal bilinguals were more elaborate about shape and orientation features of the object. As here in the example, a hearing bimodal bilingual was very specific about the orientation of the lollipop, saying that the sugar part of the lolly is pointing upwards. I argue that this specificity comes from an influence from sign. Because as shown in the bottom picture, iconic expressions in sign can contain elaborate information about how objects are placed and shaped, such as that the lolly's orientation is vertical, not horizontally. In return, using more arbitrary forms like left or right in speech made sign less elaborate about how objects are placed and shaped by using more signs for left or right. As shown in the right bottom picture, the letter hand shape L moves to the left. Thus the location of the lollipop is indicated, but not its shape or orientation. Thus I argue that speech influenced sign. In sum, in my dissertation I have shown that language diversity in modality, so vocal versus visual, influences hearing speakers and deaf signers to look at the world differently in order to talk about it. I've also shown that hearing bimodal bilinguals use both languages differently from their hearing speaking and deaf signing pairs, which in turn makes them look at the world with different eyes when preparing to speak or sign. Having presented the summary of my doctoral thesis, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Professor Hüttich, Chair of the Manuscript Committee.
Esteemed candidate, dear Francie, I congratulate you to a very fine thesis. It's very impressive work. It is theoretically a very important and timely topic, and the thesis provides very interesting experimental evidence of how differences in modality can shape cross-modal interactions. And the writing is also outstanding in style and structure, so my congratulations again to this. My question concerns the relation you make to Dan Slobin's notion of thinking for speaking. So you say, for example, in Chapter 6 that thinking for signing differs from thinking for speaking due to the iconic expressions in spatial language, and that linguistic diversity, even within the sign language, can shape the visual attention, and thus the conceptualization during message preparation. So you argue that differences in modality can shape cognition for language production. Now my question is, but what exactly is cognition for language production? Isn't that normal conceptualization for language production? So in a way one could argue that thinking for signing, similar to thinking for speaking, is just a part of a normal language production process. So what I'd like to talk to you about a bit more or explain more is what the concept of thinking for signing gets us beyond normal conceptualization for language production. So I would like to hear more about these kinds of relations from you.
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments. Yes, so where do I start with that question? So first of all, yes, so whether, the message, this is not just part of normal language production. yeah, that basically, or yeah, where that, yeah, goes back to, let's go back to the labels production model, where it says that speaking begins with the conceptualization and representing information in sort of a non-linguistic way, and then linking the linguistic units and taking language structure into account and then formulating the message. Thinking for speaking is then a sort of a cross-linguistic extension of this to that extent that languages differ, and then the earlier process also might differ. In that sense, yes, it is part of normal language production, but it just takes up on the assumption that, yeah, if language differ, then these things also differ. Looking at the thinking for signing that I claim to be different, I think that was also part of your question. What exactly is the difference? What do we get from it? Is that so I argue that especially the results I found in chapter 2 is not just simply due to cross-linguistic differences, because I didn't just look at two linguistic differences between Dutch and NGT. I looked at the difference that is driven by the modality. So these, this visual iconic motivated mappings that are in that form they are not possible in the speech. We have a difference that is driven by the modality, and that's why I call it a modality difference. It is more than, or not more, but it is not a cross-linguistic difference in that sense. And finding that signers conceptualize the visual display different by guiding visual attention differently than the speakers, with more increased attention to the other pictures than the speakers. Indeed, I argued that then the conceptualization of the message happens differently due to the modality-specific differences. So that's what I try to get at. And you also asked what I mean with cognition for language production. I formulated that way because I didn't want to make a claim about at all whole cognition that is not relevant for using language. I really tested here the thinking for speaking hypothesis. So in respect to language. So that's why I didn't say it influences cognition. So yeah, that's why I specified it. Did this answer your question now?
It did very well. Thank you. I wonder whether I can take you up there a bit here. So what do you think what these findings then tell us in a more general level about thinking for speaking? Does it basically confirm Slobin's ideas, and more or less which language, including sign language, doesn't matter so much? Or how do you see this?
Yes, my results confirm that there's thinking for speaking, that there's also thinking for signing. So it necessarily always have to differ. The two don't necessarily have to differ. Like, for example, in chapter 5, where I looked at the word order, and I found also there a link between the object that has been mentioned first in sign that also guided more visual attention. These things also have been found in spoken languages. So in that chapter, I didn't say that it differs. It's more thinking for speaking extends to thinking for signing. I think my results confirm the thinking for speaking, and that there actually is a thinking for signing, because that hasn't been shown before either. And
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Dr. Bosworth, Rochester University, United States.
Good morning. Hello. If you'll give me 1 minute to give the interpreter the text, and they will read the text of the question that I would like to have presented.
Okay.
Esteemed candidate, I am currently in Nevada, USA. My question is a historical question as it relates to the changes in synchronic language variation. Let me explain. Languages are dynamic and change over time due to various social, perceptual, and production pressures. These synchronic changes are slow to happen over many generations. Your study supports that in the case of cognition, cognitive changes happen over a few short years. So what do you think the relationship is between the cognitive changes and how it influences the language changes? Or do you believe the opposite is the case, that the cognitive changes, the synchronic changes lead to the cognitive changes? So maybe you could give an example in your response that talk about how the synchronic changes are related to the cognitive changes.
Yeah, honored madam. Thank you. So, yes, I wanted to clarify quickly. I'm not sure whether, I think I didn't talk really about that the cognitive changes happened over a few years. So, because yeah, I'm not sure exactly on which population you're actually addressing, if it's the bimodal bilinguals, because yeah, they know both languages basically from birth. So I actually don't really know when this change happened. If it was just a online change due to co-activation, or if it's something that just yeah, is sort of a more permanent change. Yeah, when this exactly happened, I cannot really tell from my yeah, from my findings, as I really just looked at like one time point. Yeah, in the language productions. Yeah, I mean, it was twice because I tested them twice, but it still was very short after, with 3 to 5 weeks in between. So in that sense, I'm not really sure whether, at least with my findings, I can now connect language change to cognitive change. I haven't really looked at the language change per se. Yes, their descriptions are different. I think due to influence of the two languages, but yeah. But maybe you can also clarify. Maybe I also didn't really understand this right.
Well, I'm asking about the two types of changes that happen at the cognitive level. The experience of someone who is internalizing sign language and how it changes the brain itself, and how the language expression in itself will influence the change. And historically, you'll notice the evolution of language happens over a long time. And you talk about it could be over years and years. A language might be more iconic in its beginnings, but become less iconic over time. And in the instance of sign languages, many sign languages started as being produced lower in the body torso, and have over time started to be expressed closer to the head and upper torso. And so I would like for you to talk about the synchronic changes that you feel your findings support.
Yeah, so it's an interesting concept. I haven't really taken it into like a change, as indeed I don't know if it's a permanent change, or if it's just an influence that happens due to being bilingual. Of course, yeah, it might happen that they always show these patterns, and this might at some point leak into general Dutch or NGT. That would be super speculative on my side now. Yeah, the two difference or the two things I do find is this semantic specificity that leaks into the Dutch, and then in return these more lexical signs or these relational lexemes for left-right coming up in the sign. There was still a difference between both the hearing speakers and the deaf signers, so it seems like in that sense, let's say generally language unrelated, it seemed to be really like an influence that happens in the bilingual people. Yeah, I'm not so sure if you're satisfied with that. But
Are you satisfied?
That was a very good answer. Thank you. I think it's a fascinating topic area.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Gullberg, Lund University, Sweden.
Thank you very much. Esteemed candidates, let me first congratulate you on your thesis. The issue of linguistic and cognitive consequences of language diversity, thinking and signing for speaking, especially in a bilingual perspective, is very close to my heart. So I really enjoyed reading your excellent thesis and I learned a lot. And the more I like something, the more questions I have. So I want to ask a question about your bimodal bilingual data. In particular, I want to ask about the cross-modal bidirectional influence from sign to speech and speech to sign and from sign to gesture. So in chapter 3, overall, you find evidence of what I would call cross-modal convergence, namely the way in which languages interact with one another and therefore become more similar. So you find an effect or an influence of sign on speech where you see increased specificity, what you call iconicity in your thesis, especially in the domain of shape and orientation. And you see an influence of sign on gesture, again with increased specificity on gesture. And then very interestingly, you also find an effect of speech on sign, but in this case, it's what you'd call reduced specificity, since you find fewer classifier constructions in sign than in the signing monolinguals. And so this is extremely interesting, since the general literature on convergence in spoken bilingualism tends to find very little evidence for increased specificity and rather tends to find reduced specificity in both languages. So you find both increase and reduction in specificity. And that really begs the question to me, if you could elaborate on why you think you find both increase and reduction in slightly different semantic domains. Is this another modality-specific thing? And could you perhaps speculate as to why you think this is happening?
Honored Madam, thank you for your compliments. Yes, so it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I would say that the increase in semantic specificity that I found from sign to speech, that this could be indeed a modality thing. The semantic specificity in sign is a very robust modality, a robust thing that can be found in the signed or manual modality. So that's why maybe I found this rather untypical finding compared to the spoken language literature. I would argue that this is driven by the modality, having at the same time the reduced semantic specificity. It's an interesting one too. Why exactly and what sort of mechanism drives this bidirectional influence? I don't have a concrete answer about this. there can be probably many factors playing into that. The modality thing on one side that drives the increase in semantic specificity in speech, but then maybe also the more dominant and majority language Dutch then influencing back down the NGT to reduce the semantic specificity, for example. Yeah, so that could be a possibility. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Are you satisfied? Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Marshall, University College London.
Thank you, esteemed candidate. First of all, congratulations on a very interesting thesis and associated papers. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your work, and it's given me lots to think about. The question that I have might seem peripheral to the thesis, but you do have a section on it in your general discussion chapter, so I assume you think that this is relevant. And that section is titled Societal Implications. You write on page 206 that the type of work presented in this thesis can have a profound impact on the debate over using sign language with deaf and hard of hearing children who've received cochlear implants. And your reasoning for claiming this seems to be, as you write on page 207, sign languages do not harm the acquisition of speech, but a spoken and a sign language support and shape each other. And I'm wondering about the logic of that argument. I'm not suggesting for a moment that deaf children should not have access to sign language. I'm wondering about the argument itself. I'm wondering whether your data really have anything to contribute to that argument. Because for a start, your study is of adult hearing bimodal bilinguals, so you're not investigating development and you're not investigating deaf bimodal bilinguals. But also importantly, if you'd found a different result, namely that there was no cross-modality influence, would you have wanted to conclude that deaf children should not have access to a signed and a spoken language? I hope that question makes sense. I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
Honored Madam, thank you for your compliments. Yeah, so what I was meant by this is these bimodal bilinguals, they can both sign and speak really well, and they have done so from very long through the adulthood, basically. So when growing up, and so now they're in an adult stage, and looking at the proficiency measures I did or that I used, they are doing fine. They speak really well and they sign really well. So that's one thing. Because I actually want to go back, sorry. Why I'm talking about it in a sense, even though I'm not looking at children, but I'm looking at adult bimodal bilinguals, is that these are a natural case of where a sign language and a spoken language are both used, and they're in an adult stage, so we can also see, are they doing fine now? If a sign language would hinder speech development, maybe they wouldn't really speak properly now, but they do, given my proficiency measurements. Now, in regard to the influence, I just wanted to be sure that people don't interpret this as, oh, they sign and speak differently, so they are actually not fine. They're actually confused, or that is actually not a good thing. In previous spoken language bilingual research, it also has been more suggested that cross-linguistic influence is more an evidence for consciousness of the bilinguals about their languages, and so it's rather a positive thing than actually a negative thing or a sign of confusion. So that was important to me that I mentioned this in this part as well. Now, if I wouldn't have found an effect, that would for sure not mean that now sign and spoken language should not be used together in deaf children language development.
Okay, thank you very much for answering my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Pernis, Universität zu Köln, Germany.
Esteemed candidate, I would also like to congratulate you on a very lovely and wonderful thesis that I enjoyed reading very much, very interesting thesis, and a wonderful use of a single experiment to get all the way through 3 populations and a number of different research questions. My question concerns chapter 2 and your analysis of whether type of iconicity differentially modulates visual attention. You draw a main distinction between the use of classifiers and relational lexemes as expressions exhibiting different types of iconicity. And within the category of relational lexemes, you have two different types. You have the lexemes right and left, and you have the lexeme next to. Mm-hmm. And I think that a prediction that could have been made is that next to would pattern differently from right and left, based, for example, on an assumption that this movement of next to could be made in all 4 directions. And so you have an aspect of planning where to put the hand. And also maybe because for Dutch, you called the lexemes right and left categorical, while you called next to non-categorical. So you didn't find right, left on the one hand and next to pattern differently. And I actually also don't know anything about how they were distributed at all. For example, across the double strategy descriptions or the relational lexeme only descriptions. So I think that would have been interesting to know. But back to my question, you didn't find that they pattern differently. And I wonder whether you think that this provides support for classifiers having a depicting versus a classifying function, as you say. And if so, why? I want you to elaborate a little bit on this theoretical point using the next to and right-left distinction.
Yeah, honored madam, thank you for your compliments. Yes, indeed, I haven't really specified this or distinguished between left, right, and next to in the signer data. I did so in the speaking data because there was a difference in sort of level of informativeness. So for left, right, it was clear where the figure is, and next to not so much if it was a more complex display. So where left and right was present, and so in sign, the direction is still indicated as for the left and right sign, as well for the next to the left and the next to the right. So that's why I didn't distinguish this. It's surely a good point that this might have actually also shown a difference, given that it also can be used for front behind. Maybe that also would have done something with their visual attention. I think the distribution was very, very varying. So I find both next to quite often as well as left and right. But I haven't really analyzed this. I have never really looked at tearing them apart, basically. But it is surely a good point. Coming to your question about why I basically argue, or what the evidence is for the classifiers that have a depicting function, is that if it would be if it would be something obligatory that has to be always there, then we might not really find an effect in the message conceptualization. So the reason that I find this variation in using relational lexeme, but also using classifiers and using them together, and then the different effects with conceptualization, I had more the feeling that there's something they want to emphasize to highlight, so that's why I mentioned that Did this answer your question now?
Yeah, and so you would also say that that next to.
Yeah.
I mean, you would basically give next to, even though it kind of, you can use it in all four directions. You would give it the same, more categorical classifying status as right left. And
Yes.
you would say that they are
I would.
really different beasts than classifiers.
Yes, yes, exactly, because they resemble mostly the location, the spatial location, but not the shape or orientation. So they are not this more depicting the whole thing than the classifiers. So yes, I would more group them, and I did with the relational lexemes, with the left-right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Krasborn.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, I'd like to join the others in offering my compliments for a very interesting series of studies. And on a more specific note, I'd like to commend you for your interest in the NGT use of bimodal bilinguals, hearing bimodal bilinguals, or CODES, which as a group within the NGT language community are greatly understudied compared to deaf native signers, and they're often overlooked. We've investigated them for what makes them special, the native acquisition of both the sign language and a spoken language. My question, however, is about the deaf NGT signers. In your studies, you compare monolingual Dutch speakers with deaf signers and with hearing bimodal bilinguals. Now, while hearing Dutch speakers don't usually get any sign language input in their primary education, deaf NGT signers get extensive exposure to visual forms of spoken Dutch from kindergarten on, as you already indicate yourself in your introductory chapter. Although the focus on spoken Dutch has diminished in the last decades in favor of more bilingual education, Dutch still has a prominent place in deaf education to this day, both as a subject language and as an instruction language. Although you state on page 37 that, I quote, NGT was the primary language of instruction, end quote, most of their teachers are actually late learners of NGT and not necessarily fluent in that language. So much signed education takes the form of what I like to call visual Dutch, or more commonly called sign-supported speech. Irrespective of the details of this and of how this exactly pans out for the deaf subjects in your study, I think it's fair to say that all deaf people in the Netherlands are bimodal bilingual in the sense of having had a lot of exposure to and having knowledge of the spoken language. You acknowledge this yourself, for instance, in this section that described the participants in chapter 3. And my question is, would you have expected any of your core findings to be different had you been able to use an imaginary population of truly monolingual deaf NGT signers to compare to the group of hearing bimodal bilinguals?
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments. I think so. Yeah, indeed, they have plenty of Dutch knowledge, and they are also certainly bimodal, bilingual. So there might still be some sort of influences from Dutch. However, yeah. So this was my native, most native group I could get, basically. If I would expect really different outcomes, I think they showed the modality-specific patterns that I have expected. So, in that sense, they use plenty of classifiers. I mean, yes, they combine them actually with the relational lexemes, which was rather hasn't been shown so much before, but nevertheless they chose quite iconic descriptions to describe the spatial relations, and they also mentioned the ground really often first, so that was almost sealing, I would say, that they did that. So in that sense, I would say they behaved on what I would have expected. Yeah. So that's my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to a very efficient exchange of questions and answers, There's plenty of time for a second round. And I would like to give the floor to the chair of the manuscript committee, Professor Hüttig.
So for my second question, I'd like you to speculate a bit and go beyond the data, if you like. So what about effects of language on cognition when people do not prepare for language production? So what about signers' potential for effects of language on cognition in a strong Worfian sense? For signers, we have not only a language difference, but also a modality difference, as you pointed out. So is there perhaps a bigger potential for strong Worfian effects in signers? What do you think?
I think this is a very big question that maybe shouldn't just be answered with a simple yes or no. I think it's probably more useful to look at sort of the mechanisms, or more the processes that are relating to this link between language and the cognitive processes. Indeed, that's really hard to tell from my thesis because I haven't looked at this at all. Because they hasn't been so much out there. I mean, I think I sort of laid like the first stepping stone to see like what happens when using language. And then basically the next step would be to build up on this and see how this, for example, happens in different domains or something like this, before then really going actually to testing the more stronger Wolffian hypothesis. I'm not sure whether I'm so much wanted to speculate what this would look like. Because I think that's just really hard to do. But it would surely be interesting to test this. I think also probably a challenge to experimentally test this, because one really needs to make sure that language is blocked. Usually sort of these more interference or distractor tasks simultaneously have been used, which are often non-linguistic because they seem to be more effective. I don't know how signers will do looking at pictures. Maybe they have to remember them and then they need to count with their hands, 1, 2, as studies look into this, did this previously. I wouldn't even know how well this would work, that would be a way of looking into this. But what exactly the effects were, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. It's not straightforward to try to get it as experimentally.
Yeah.
But if you have to have a guess, do you think the potential is bigger here for Wolffian effects than like in non-signers?
It could be. It could be. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It could be. But I mean, nevertheless, finding an effect like that is language related is already something, and is already quite nice, I would say.
Yeah, I take your maybe as an answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Gullberg, Lund University.
Yes, thank you. Partly I want to invite you to speculate. So I find the results from chapters 3 and 5 extremely interesting. So in one case, you find a bidirectional influence from sign to speech and vice versa. That's in the domain of iconicity or semantics. And in the other domain, when you're looking at word order, you find a unidirectional influence, so only an influence from sign to speech, but not in the other direction. Now, it's not unusual to find different effects in different linguistic domains when you look at bilinguals, and not necessarily to find a symmetrical influence always. So that's not unusual in and of itself, but the explanations for why you find different effects are interesting. And you seem to discuss two options. Now, in the domain of word order, you suggest that the preference for ground first is based on a sort of a cognitive bias. But when you discuss the models, you're also suggesting that there is something about categorical linguistic expressions that leave less room, as it were, for this bidirectional, bimodal influence. And that seems extremely interesting to me. It sort of raises the question here. So now you've looked at spatial language, which of course is what sign language is especially good at. So what do you think would happen if you were to look at your bimodal bilinguals in linguistic domains outside of spatial language, where perhaps the differences between sign and spoken language are either smaller or greater, right? It raises an interesting question to me, what you would predict if you were to look at other areas of language when you compare the bilinguals bimodally.
Yeah, it certainly would depend on the domain. Is it something, where there is a modality difference again, or is it a domain where there are simply cross-linguistic differences? It would be very, very similar studies that have been done on spoken language bilinguals. As we know there, it's always hard to say what comes out and when does it happen, right? So it's I think we are not there yet that we can sort of predict what type of influence we find and when and in what population and in which domain. There have been these theories trying to explain this, like the Meisken bilingual optimization strategy hypothesis, right? Which I also find really hard to relate to my data. Sometimes or most of the time, or sometimes the hypothesis is supporting empirical evidence, but sometimes also not, also in spoken language bilingual research. So these influences are very, very, unpredictable, I would say. So I guess it's really hard to now speculate on precise or exact, type of influences I would find, right?
But I mean, in a sense, I'm kind of wondering whether you think that the modality difference is offering either new facilitation possibilities or conversely, modality-specific hindrances for cross-linguistic influence, because that seems to be what you're suggesting in the two ways in which you discuss the influence. Is that sort of a correct assessment of how you see this?
Yes, and I think that's also what I show in chapter 3 and 5. And one, it is supporting, basically, and then the other, it's hindering, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Marshall, University College London.
Thank you, esteemed candidate. Hello again. So my question now relates to something that you said in answer to my first question about the NGT proficiency of the bimodal bilinguals. And I'd like to discuss with you how you assessed their NGT skills. So you used an assessment tool for narrative production that's been developed for the study of BSL development. And certainly you can use it to assess production in other languages. That's not the issue. The issue is that it is only standardized in BSL up to the age of 11 years. And you're using the scores on this task to suggest that your bimodal bilinguals are equal in NGT proficiency to your deaf participants. Can you really conclude that, or is it maybe that this task just isn't sensitive to individual differences in adulthood?
So it's right, it's only standardized for the children, so that's why I compared this to the scores of the deaf signers to have a comparison. So I simply used basically this assignment tool to have like sort of criteria and then compare them. Whether it's not sensitive enough, I would say that it's a quite detailed assessment tool. I think it contains the most important things in regard to the narrative, and I think it's suitable enough. I did see variation in the scores. I think it sort of worked. But yeah, indeed, there wasn't really a difference to the deaf signers, and that's why I sort of concluded that their proficiency in NGT is very similar. At least, in respect was also important to my experiment. Like, yeah, so especially the spatial details and so forth. Yeah.
So can I push you a little bit further to speculate on how differences in NGT proficiency amongst your bilinguals might be related then to cross-modal influence?
Proficiency can certainly play a role. If there's one bimodal bilingual who is not as proficient as the others, maybe there's a stronger influence from Dutch, for example, or maybe less influence to the NGT. I mean, I all looked at the group level, right? I didn't really look individually. So individually it might play a role.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I give the floor to Professor Pernes, Universiteit zu Köln.
Hello again, esteemed candidate. I want to ask a question about the use of visual resemblance and semantic relevance, and whether these are really the most appropriate labels. Specifically, you defined visually similar pictures with respect to signers having to plan where to put their hands in space. And you defined semantically relevant pictures in terms of signers having to choose the correct semantic form or categorical form. But I was wondering, actually, about the lack of competition from pictures with topological relations, given this distinction of visual resemblance and categorical form, because of course for topological relations, they can be equally encoded, also encoded using classifier predicates or relational lexemes. So exactly this distinction doesn't seem to explain to me the lack of influence or the lack of competition from topological relations. So I was wondering what you think about, because you talked only very little about the viewpoint dependence aspect of these pictures, and I wondered whether you could bring this into relation a little bit to your findings.
Certainly, and that's also why I termed it as visual resemblance or visual similar, because it comes from, so front, behind, and left, right are more similar because they're both viewpoint dependent, and they require a sort of perspective taking, while the topological relations are different in that sense because they do not require that. So that's where this distinction actually is coming from, that I say front, behind, and left, right are more visual similar than the topological ones. In a sense to the semantic relatedness, well, that was like belonging to the same category like left or right, basically. Yes, so that's what I meant by this, and that's why I expected not so much competition from the topological relations, because they are supposed to be different from the viewpoint dependent relations. Yeah.
So do you think it would be? Do you think that saying viewpoint dependence rather than visual similarity would be better? Or why did you choose visual similarity instead of viewpoint dependence?
Good question. I think when I used that term, visual resemblance, it was more based on how the pictures in the display look like, but it's certainly driven by the viewpoint dependency. Mm-hmm. So I could have maybe also called it viewpoint dependency, but yeah, I based it more on like how the displays were put together.
Thank you.
Okay, 1 minute left, and so I give the floor to Professor Krasborn.
Esteemed candidates, on page 37, you summarize how you determined the sample sizes of your studies in the first full paragraph on that page, which I find a bit difficult to understand. And perhaps you could help me digest it.
Thank you. The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my doctoral thesis to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisor, as well as all those who have honored this ceremony with their online presence.
Thank you. The Doctoral Examination Board retreats for its deliberations. On behalf of the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor Ojurek to discharge the task assigned to her.
Okay, dear Francie. Oh, I should take this. Oh, sorry.
In the name of the...
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Council of Deans, I hereby confer upon you, Francie Manhardt, born in Erfurt, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor. Congratulations.
Please take a seat. The eulogy will be delivered by Professor Ojurek and by Dr. Brouwer.
Okay. Dear Francie, Dr. Manhardt, what a relief. Here we are finally. We came to the end of our wonderful scientific journey together. I'm so grateful to you that you spent so many hours, months, and years of your life on this project where you gave all you had, really, in health and sickness. When we first interviewed you for the project, you were very quiet and did not say much. And in fact, we thought you were not interested in the project at all. And we called you again to be sure. But at the end, I'm so happy that we gave the job to you and you made a success out of it. In this long but also short time, you overcame many obstacles. This was not the easiest dissertation project. You learned not only Dutch, which was not your native language, but also Dutch Sign Language, the two languages you had to work with. You worked not only with undergraduate students, easy to find, like other PhD students, but with Dutch Sign Language users traveling all around the Holland to conduct your study. You had to learn eye tracking and became an R wizard. You mastered ethics and data management, and you became expert in beating every nasty editor we got, and we got those papers out. And in the last stages, you had to finish your thesis in summer corona lockdown. This was a big disappointment. Doing all this, you also continuously cared for lab management, and you were the translator between Tom and the rest of our group who already spoke all different languages to begin with. Nevertheless, you made us delicious vegan cakes and glühwein and fed us all. Yeah, she's a very good cook. You always helped everyone, and you were the visible helping hand behind every intern or activity we had in the lab, and you were our social butterfly. Here, I would also like to thank Tom Autengebart for his support to you and to the project in general. We already miss you a lot. Your new colleagues probably by now realize how lucky they are to have you. I wish you and your partner all the success in your new life. Happy to meet you, by the way. And also, I would like to congratulate your parents, who could not come due to the circumstances, for having such a great daughter. And I would like to thank them for their support in these challenging years you had. Be careful, German is coming. Congratuleren mit deiner Tochter. Now I give the floor to your co-promoter, Susanna Brouwer.
Dear Dr. Manhardt, dear Francie, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on this major achievement. Devoting your life to science is no small feat. In my speech for you, I would like to take you and everybody else present on this festive day with me on how I have experienced our journey together. I call it the tale of two ladies in science. I remember the first day when I met you very well. I went to the MPI for my new job as a postdoctoral researcher in Asli's Fiji project. We had our first encounter in the corridor of our future offices. I saw a young lady with a big smile on her face, eager and full of excitement to start her PhD project. You already seemed to know who I was, well informed, as always. Our first common task was to program an experimental script in presentation for our groundbreaking visual world eye tracking experiment, in which we measured language production in a novel way. We worked on this script in your lovely office full of plants. And we did this for days, and those days turned into weeks, and finally into months to get the script up and running. Blood, sweat, and tears. But I was happy to see that my love for the eye tracking methodology was contagious. After you went on the road with the eye tracker across the whole country to collect data from all those different and hard to find participant groups, we entered one of my other favorite worlds, the world of R, a statistical program. And you picked up the skill of writing R code so easily. And I could tell you loved those programming puzzles, because you could not leave the MPI until you found the solution to a problem. Halfway your trajectory, we had the opportunity to go to a conference together in Trondheim, Norway. We had many personal chats, and we discovered that we both enjoyed doing yoga, preferably with Adrian and Benji. Namaste. At the moment, You were not seeing someone special, but I am very pleased to see that today, at your defense, truly everything comes together. Hi, Mathieu. Happy to see you and happy to see that you finally joined the club. Francie, you have so much discipline, and as icing on the cake, your perseverance has been rewarded with a publication in Psychological Science, an incredibly high-impact journal. I received emails from colleagues who literally wrote to me that they were so jealous that I had the luck of supervising such a brilliant PhD student. Yes, I was. Dear Francie, you are such a kind and loyal person. Even after I left the MPI, you still visited me almost every week in the Erasmus building. I can tell how much you have grown, scientifically, and as a person over the years. My little academic sister is not so little anymore. I know it has not always been easy, but I hope you can look back with that same smile you showed me on the first day that I met you. I wish you all the best for the future, and this is how the tale of two ladies in science ends.
Thank you. I think that the members of the committee have now the opportunity to congratulate our candidate. Shall we preserve the same order as the whole hour? Professor Hütti.
So dear Francie, many congratulations. As I said already earlier, to very impressive work and to also a very nice, great defense performance today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Professor Goldberg.
Yes, thank you. Dear Francie, I allow myself to address you by your first name. I should say Dr. Manhardt, really. Congratulations, my warmest congratulations. I think it's a wonderful thesis, and I'm sure you will do very, very well in whatever endeavours you engage in. So congratulations. I hope you can celebrate.
Thank you.
Okay. Professor Marshall.
Dr. Manhardt, congratulations. Well done. And I'm looking forward to following your career and your future work.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Professor Pernes.
Dear Francie, liebe Francie, congratulations on a wonderful thesis and a very well performed defense. And by the way, I also do yoga with Adrian and Benji. So.
Professor Kasborn.
Congratulations, Francie. It's great to see you standing here and great to read your thesis after having seen you grow up, as it were, in our master program. It's a pleasure witnessing here you get your degree today, and I certainly hope this allows you to pursue your further ambitions and ideas in the future.
Okay, thank you. Dear Dr. Manhardt, on behalf of the Council of Deans, I would like to congratulate you and your partner Mathieu. Und ich möchte Ihre Eltern und auch die anderen Mitglieder Ihrer Familie in meine Glückwünsche einbeziehen. Es ist wirklich schade, dass Sie bei dieser akademischen Zeremonie nicht richtig anwesend sein konnten. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to close the ceremony with a prayer in Latin and ask you to stand up. Gratias tibi agimus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this ceremony.
Well, congratulations, Francie, and it was an honor to be part of this.